Hello and welcome to another video. In this video I'll be repairing these two OnePlus 5 phones by replacing their screens with new AMOLED screens for 30 euros a piece. After that I'll see what this flagship phone from 2017 can do in 2021. Displays on both of the phones were fully dead and didn't display anything, even the backlight, but the buttons did light up, so I knew that they weren't fully dead. One of the devices had a stuck SIM tray that I didn't manage to open with any methods. To begin the disassembly, I took out the two Torx screws and began to pry the display up from the phone. I didn't need to be careful because the display was broken anyway, but the SIM tray was still stuck, which made it harder to disassemble the device since I couldn't do it properly due to being unable to separate the right side of the back cover due to the SIM tray being located there. Instead, I needed to separate the display and back cover from the top, which was hard because there's hinges on the top part, and the intended way of disassembly is to first separate the bottom and then both of the sides, and then it's supposed to lift up from the hinges at the top. I took a look at the back cover of the other phone I had already disassembled, and what I mean by hinges are actually just a couple notches that work as hinges, and I was able to lift the top part up by using just a bit more force. With the broken SIM tray out of the way, I next took off the back cover, which has the USB port integrated in it and the flex cable of the battery. Next I took out the speaker on the bottom part of the phone, and after that the circuit board that was under it. Next I took all the screws holding the main board in place, and after that it was time to take out the battery. Getting the battery out unharmed may often be the most difficult part of repairs, but with this specific phone OnePlus has a clever solution with a pull tab. After lifting the main logic board up from the phone, I could safely start disassembling the display assembly without fears of damaging the logic board. Note that you only need to do this next step if you buy a display with no frame attached to it. Most screens for this phone seem to come with a frame, and that is way easier and a much less time-consuming solution. It's also only a bit more expensive. However, I wanted to try replacing the screen without replacing the frame with these phones. The display turned out to be quite difficult to detach from the frame, since the adhesive they have used with this seems to be the strongest stuff I have come by to this point. The glass detaches from the frame, but only in very small bits. Even a lot of heat from a heat gun didn't seem to help that much. I tried different tools, but nothing really seemed to make this process easier. I tried using a knife, for example, but I don't recommend it since it could slip and be quite dangerous. I ended up just mainly using a plastic pick and a flathead screwdriver to detach the screen from the frame. The screen edges only have a bit of glue and they are easy to detach from the frame, but the top and bottom parts do have a lot of glue and it's very frustrating to detach these tiny pieces bit by bit, and there will also be lots of tiny glass bits flying around, so it would probably be wisest to protect your eyes while you do it. After detaching all the larger shards of glass from the frame, you need to also, after that, look that there's no tiny bits that could be left under the new screen, which you don't want to do, because that would possibly cause the new screen to easily break. This footage is of course heavily edited and sped up, and in fact I spent couple hours of doing this with both of the phones, and so in a nutshell I don't recommend buying a screen without frame. The one with frame seems to be very much worth it, as it only costs a couple euros more. Having finally cleaned the frame of all the tiny bits of glass, I set the new screen on the frame and reassembled the phone so that I could see if the screen works properly and if the device itself indeed works, since I wasn't quite sure of that yet. It didn't instantly power up, but when I left it on a charger for some time, it did boot up. After the device started up, I could test the display's touch on the whole area of the touchscreen, and that seemed okay, as did the brightness controls, which worked like they should. Overall, this display seemed to be very good quality, despite not being advertised as original display. Next, I disassembled the display again from the phone, and I needed to modify the home button or fingerprint reader a bit. The screen already had this silver frame for the fingerprint sensor in place, so I needed to detach that part from my original fingerprint sensor. Also, I transferred the speaker grill and cleaned the speaker since I had access to it. These things tend to collect quite a bit of dust. Another thing I needed to transfer over to the new screen was these black rubber pieces under the buttons. With those moved over, the new screen is ready for installation. I assembled all components on the frame back on properly and then proceeded to apply some glue on the frame under the display. I tend to rather use too much than too little glue, since with too little the screen could come off at some point. Just after I had set the screen down on the frame, I noticed that it didn't have the earpiece grill, which had fallen off before I installed this screen, so I needed to carefully separate the display and put the earpiece grill back. Having glued down both of the screens of the phones, I tested both screens once again and everything seemed okay, so I Switched both phones off, applied some rubber bands to keep the screens on place, and then let the glue dry for a day. I also applied a tiny amount of glue for the home buttons and left it also dry. To put the home button's flex cable back in its correct place, I needed to disassemble the bottom part of the phone a bit. I took out the logic board and put the cable under it, and then I could connect it properly to the logic board. After the glue had dried, I could proceed assembling the phones properly. Before I assembled this phone, I tried the SIM tray mechanism, since I didn't want it to get stuck again, but surprisingly the SIM tray did work perfectly this time. After all the screws were on their proper places, I cleaned the camera lenses, and then I could finally assemble the phone back up by attaching the screen to the back cover. After booting up the device, I confirmed once again that the SIM tray was perfectly working, and then I checked that all the cameras were working and there wasn't any dirt that had gotten on the lenses. When I'm ordering parts for a phone, I usually get a case as well to protect the phone in the future. Looking at the specs, it seems like I have one OnePlus 5 with 6 GB of RAM and one with 8. Both are quite impressive specs for a smartphone from 2017. Both phones had Android 9, but I was able to upgrade them to Android 10 via the OnePlus website. PUBG and Call of Duty Mobile run well on both devices, but that's not really a surprise. Almost any modern device can run those games, but I was very interested how this 2017 flagship would handle Fortnite in 2021. It turns out even the lower spec 6 GB version runs Fortnite still very well in 2021. There's some lag, but it's caused by the Wi-Fi access point being quite far from the location I was filming this. The lag was non-existent when I moved the phone closer.